Teacher sends black girl home without pants. Dad's unexpected arrival changes everything. Who her dad is. She walked out of school humiliated, sent home without pants. Just for a dress code violation. But when her father arrived demanding answers, the entire school learned a lesson they'd never forget. What happened next changed everything. It was an unusually chilly autumn morning in the small town of Elmwood, where everybody knew everybody. The kind of town where the local diner still had a bulletin board filled with paper flyers, and kids biked to school without a care in the world. Elmwood High School, perched at the top of Willow Street, was the heart of the community, a place parents trusted and teenagers tolerated. It was a seemingly ordinary school, but on this particular day, something extraordinary was about to unfold. The morning had started like any other for 13-year-old Maya Carter. She woke up to the sound of her alarm clock blaring at 6:30 a.m., reluctantly rolled out of bed, and shuffled into the kitchen, where her mother had already laid out her breakfast. Maya was a bright, spirited girl with a love for art and an insatiable curiosity about the world. Her soft brown eyes sparkled with intelligence, and her coiled hair was pulled into two neat puffs that her mother had spent extra time perfecting that morning. Her uniform was simple but neatly pressed, a white button-up shirt, a navy sweater with the school's emblem, and a matching plaid skirt. However, Maya couldn't shake the feeling of unease as she ate her cereal that morning. Something about the day felt off, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. As she walked to school, Maya couldn't have guessed that the unease in her chest would be the least of her worries by the end of the day. Elmwood High School was bustling with activity when Maya arrived. Students hurried to their lockers, chatting about their weekend plans and dreading their upcoming math test. Teachers stood at their classroom doors, sipping coffee and nodding good morning to the passing kids. Everything seemed normal, yet beneath the surface, the day was about to take a turn Maya would never forget. The first few periods passed uneventfully. Maya sat at her desk in history class, doodling in the margins of her notebook while the teacher droned on about the American Revolution. It wasn't until gym class that the day's events began to spiral out of control. Maya was shy about changing in the locker room, as many teenage girls were. She had always felt self-conscious about her appearance, especially at a school where being different wasn't always celebrated. The gym teacher, Ms. Peterson, was known for her strict demeanor and no-nonsense attitude. She demanded absolute compliance with the dress code and had little patience for students who didn't follow the rules. That day, Maya realized too late that she had forgotten to pack her gym shorts. Panic set in as she rummaged through her bag, but there was no sign of the navy shorts required for class. I forgot them, Maya stammered, her voice barely above a whisper as she stood in front of Miss Peterson. The teacher's eyes narrowed and a deep frown creased her face. "That's unacceptable, Maya," she said, her voice cold. "You know the rules. If you're not properly dressed for gym class, you can't participate." "I'm sorry," Maya said, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "It won't happen again." But Miss Peterson wasn't satisfied with an apology. She was the kind of person who saw every minor infraction as an opportunity to enforce authority. And today was no different. "You're going to the office," she declared, motioning for Maya to follow her. The walk to the principal's office felt like an eternity. Maya's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to think of what to say. She had never been in serious trouble before, and the idea of being sent to the office over something as small as forgetting her gym shorts felt like a bad dream. When they arrived, Miss Peterson explained the situation to the school secretary, who gave Maya a stern look before asking her to sit on the bench outside the office. The minutes dragged on, and Maya's anxiety grew with each passing second. Finally, the principal, Mrs. Hughes, appeared. She was a tall, imposing woman with sharp features and an air of authority that made students shrink in her presence. After a brief discussion with Miss Peterson, Mrs. Hughes turned her attention to Maya. "This is a serious violation of the dress code," she said, her tone clipped. "We expect all students to follow the rules, and forgetting your gym shorts is no excuse." Maya nodded, fighting back tears. Mrs. Hughes's next words would haunt her for years to come. If you can't follow the rules, you can't stay here today. You'll have to call someone to pick you up or walk home. Either way, you can't remain on campus. Maya was stunned. But I can't walk home like this. I don't have pants on. Mrs. Hughes crossed her arms. That's not my problem, young lady. Maybe next time you'll remember to pack your gym shorts. And with that, Maya was dismissed from school, sent out into the cold autumn air with nothing but her long sweater to cover her legs. She pulled it down as far as it would go, but it barely reached her mid-thigh. Humiliated and freezing, she began the long walk home. What Mrs. Hughes and Miss Peterson didn't know was that Maya wasn't just any student. Her father, Jordan Carter, was someone they should have thought twice about crossing. And when he found out what had happened to his daughter, their world would never be the same. As Maya trudged down the sidewalk, her sweater pulled tightly around her for warmth and dignity. Tears stung her eyes. The autumn wind nipped at her bare legs, and she could feel the stares of passing cars as they slowed to take in the strange sight of a young girl walking alone in such a state. Shame burned in her chest, but beneath it was a growing sense of anger and confusion. How could they send her out like this? How could adults, the ones who were supposed to protect her, humiliate her so cruelly? Maya's neighborhood wasn't far from the school, but the walk felt endless. Every step deepened her resolve. Though she didn't yet know what to do, her mind raced with questions. What would her dad say? Would he be mad at her? Disappointed? Would he think she had done something wrong? Jordan Carter wasn't the kind of father to take anything lying down. A former Marine turned civil rights attorney, he had built his career fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. He had a commanding presence, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a deep voice and a sharp mind. Despite his imposing exterior, he was a devoted father who adored Maya. He had always told her, no matter what happens, you come to me. We'll face it together. Maya knew her dad would stand by her, but the thought of telling him about what had happened made her stomach churn. She hated the idea of being a burden, of causing him to worry or, worse, get angry on her behalf. But as she turned the corner onto their quiet street, her resolve hardened. She couldn't hide this from him, not when it felt so wrong. Their house, a modest two-story home with a well-kept lawn, came into view. Maya spotted her dad's car in the driveway, a black SUV that always seemed too big for their small family of two. She quickened her pace, her bare legs trembling from the cold and exhaustion. When she opened the door, the familiar scent of cinnamon and fresh coffee greeted her. Her dad was in the kitchen, typing furiously on his laptop. He looked up as she entered, his expression shifting from surprise to concern the moment he saw her. Maya? Jordan's deep voice was tinged with alarm. He pushed back his chair and strode toward her. What happened? Why are you home? And why? His eyes scanned her from head to toe, landing on her bare legs. His jaw tightened. Where are your pants? Maya hesitated, her throat tightening as she tried to find the words. I forgot my gym shorts, she stammered. The teacher sent me to the principal, and then she said I couldn't stay at school. She made me leave. Jordan's expression darkened, his brows knitting together in a mixture of anger and disbelief. She sent you home like this? Without calling me? Without making sure you were okay? His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made Maya's heart race. She nodded, her eyes welling up again. She said it was my fault for not following the dress code. Jordan inhaled sharply, his fists clenching at his sides. For a moment, he said nothing, his mind clearly working through the implications of what he'd just heard. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but filled with a quiet fury. That's unacceptable, he said. No child should ever be treated like this. You did nothing wrong, Maya. Do you understand me? She nodded again, her tears spilling over despite her attempts to hold them back. Jordan pulled her into a hug, his strong arms wrapping around her protectively. I'm so sorry this happened to you, he murmured. But I promise you, they're going to answer for this. Over the next hour, as Maya warmed up and changed into comfortable clothes, Jordan made phone calls. He started with the school, but when the secretary informed him that Mrs. Hughes was unavailable, his patience wore thin. He left a message, his voice calm but firm, making it clear that he expected a call back immediately. Then he called his assistant at the law firm. Jordan rarely mixed his personal life with his work, but this was different. He explained the situation, detailing every humiliating detail Maya had shared, and asked his assistant to pull any information she could find about Elmwood High's policies on discipline and dress codes. By the time he hung up, Jordan had a plan. He wasn't just going to confront the school. He was going to make sure this never happened to another child again. Meanwhile, at Elmwood High, the principal and Miss Peterson were blissfully unaware of the storm heading their way. Mrs. Hughes sat in her office, reviewing paperwork for an upcoming board meeting, while Miss Peterson supervised the gym class as if nothing had happened. Neither of them could have guessed that the decision they had made that morning would soon become the focus of a legal battle that would shake the entire community. Back at home, Maya watched her father with a mixture of awe and gratitude. She had always known he was strong, but seeing him leap into action for her made her feel a new kind of respect. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to hope that things might be okay. But neither Maya nor her father could have anticipated the twists and turns that lay ahead. The journey they were about to embark on would test their courage, their resilience, and their faith in justice. And at the center of it all was a secret, one that would change everything they thought they knew about Elmwood High School. The following morning, Jordan Carter arrived at Elmwood High School with a purpose that could not be mistaken. Dressed in a sharp navy suit and carrying a black leather briefcase, he exuded an air of authority that turned heads the moment he stepped through the double doors. Maya had begged him to let her stay home, still mortified by the previous day's events. But Jordan insisted she come with him. "You deserve to see this through," he'd told her. "This isn't just about what happened to you. It's about standing up for what's right." As they entered the front office, the secretary looked up, startled by Jordan's presence. Her gaze shifted to Maya, whose face was partially hidden behind her father. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," the secretary said, her voice unsure. "How can I help you?" "I'm here to speak with Principal Hughes," Jordan said firmly. "Now," the secretary hesitated, glancing at her computer screen. "I'll see if she's available." "She'll make herself available," Jordan interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. The secretary's face paled, and she quickly picked up the phone to notify the principal. Less than a minute later, Mrs. Hughes appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully composed but her posture stiff. "Mr. Carter," she said, forcing a smile. "What a surprise. Please, come into my office." Jordan nodded, placing a protective hand on Maya's shoulder as they followed the principal into her office. The room was neat and impersonal, with framed diplomas lining the walls and a small potted plant on the corner of the desk. Mrs. Hughes gestured for them to sit, but Jordan remained standing, his towering frame making the room feel smaller. "I trust you know why I'm here," Jordan began, his voice steady but laced with tension. "I want an explanation for why my daughter was humiliated and sent home yesterday in such an inappropriate manner." Mrs. Hughes folded her hands on the desk, her smile fading. "Mr. Carter, I assure you that our policies are designed to maintain order and discipline. Maya violated the dress code by not bringing the appropriate gym attire. Unfortunately, rules are rules, and we have to enforce them." "Enforce them?" Jordan's voice rose slightly, his frustration evident. "By sending a 13-year-old girl home without ensuring her safety? Without so much as a phone call to her parents? Do you understand the message you sent, not just to Maya, but to every student in this school?" Mrs. Hughes shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "I understand your concerns, but we have procedures in place. Procedures that humiliate children and put them in harm's way." Jordan cut in. "Let me ask you something, Mrs. Hughes. If Maya weren't a black girl, would she have been treated the same way?" The question hung in the air like a storm cloud. Mrs. Hughes's face flushed and she sputtered, "Mr. Carter, I can assure you that race has nothing to do with our policies. Then prove it, Jordan said, leaning forward. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you singled out my daughter for punishment that didn't fit the so-called crime. I'll be requesting records of disciplinary actions to see if your enforcement of these policies is as unbiased as you claim. Before Mrs. Hughes could respond, the door opened, and Miss Peterson walked in. She froze when she saw Jordan, her eyes darting to Maya, who sat silently in her chair, her head down. Miss Peterson, Jordan said coldly, I was hoping you'd join us. Maybe you can explain why you thought it was appropriate to escalate a minor infraction into an event that left my daughter humiliated and shamed. Miss Peterson cleared her throat. Mr. Carter, I was simply following school policy. Students are required to wear the appropriate attire for gym class, and Maya wasn't prepared. I sent her to the principal as per protocol. Protocol? Jordan's voice was razor-sharp. You could have handled this in any number of ways. Ways that didn't involve sending a child out into the cold, half-dressed. Did it ever occur to you to show some compassion? To think about the impact of your actions? Miss Peterson opened her mouth to reply, but closed it again, clearly at a loss for words. The tension in the room was palpable. But before Jordan could press further, the door opened again. This time, it was the school superintendent, Mr. Harold Green. Tall and thin, with graying hair and a calm demeanor. He had been called in by the secretary, who had overheard the heated conversation. Good morning, Mr. Green said, his voice measured. I'm Harold Green, the district superintendent. I understand there's a concern regarding yesterday's incident. Jordan turned to face him. Concern is an understatement, Mr. Green. My daughter was humiliated and sent home inappropriately, and I want accountability. I see, Mr. Green said, nodding. I'd like to take this conversation to the district office, where we can review the situation thoroughly. It's clear this is a serious matter, and we need to address it appropriately. Though he was reluctant to leave without immediate answers, Jordan agreed. Fine, but understand this. I won't stop until the school and everyone responsible is held accountable. No child should ever experience what Maya did. As they left the school, Maya looked up at her father, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. But even as she felt the weight of his unwavering support, a nagging question lingered in her mind. Why had they been so quick to dismiss her? And what would happen now that her dad was involved? Neither Maya nor Jordan could have predicted the obstacles ahead. The fight for justice would uncover deep-rooted biases, hidden agendas, and a secret that would leave the entire community in shock. Jordan Carter had no intention of letting the matter rest. By the time they arrived at the district office later that afternoon, he had already begun gathering evidence and outlining his next steps. The meeting with Superintendent Green was tense, but it was clear that Green wasn't prepared for the sheer force of Jordan's determination. Mr. Carter, Green began, folding his hands on the conference table, I understand your frustration, and I assure you that we take this matter seriously. We will conduct a thorough review of the incident. Jordan leaned forward, his sharp gaze fixed on Green. A review isn't enough. I want to see the disciplinary records, the dress code policies, and the guidelines that allowed this to happen. And I expect transparency, not excuses. Green hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. We'll provide you with the relevant documents, but these things take time. I hope you understand. I understand that delayed tactics won't work, Jordan replied, his voice steady. Every day this goes unaddressed is another day the school fails its students. As the meeting dragged on, Maya sat quietly beside her father, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. It was comforting to see her dad fight for her, but the weight of being at the center of such a battle was overwhelming. The real blow came when Green mentioned the possibility of disciplinary action against Maya. I must point out, he said, his tone measured, that your daughter's failure to comply with the dress code contributed to the situation. We may need to address that as well. Jordan's jaw tightened and Maya's heart sank. Disciplinary action? Jordan said, his voice rising. Are you seriously suggesting punishing my daughter for being mistreated? She forgot her gym shorts, a minor mistake, and instead of handling it with compassion, your staff humiliated her. If anyone deserves disciplinary action, it's the adults who allowed this to happen. Green raised his hands defensively. I'm simply stating the facts, Mr. Carter. We'll review everything thoroughly. But Jordan wasn't convinced. As they left the meeting, he turned to Maya. Don't let them scare you, baby girl. This isn't your fault. Despite her father's reassurance, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. Meanwhile, back at Elmwood High, the whispers had already begun. Students and staff alike were abuzz with rumors about Maya and her father. Miss Peterson, who had remained silent during the confrontation in Mrs. Hughes's office, was beginning to feel the pressure. Other teachers were questioning her actions, and some parents had even called the school to express their outrage. But it wasn't just the staff who were affected. Maya's classmates, many of whom had seen her walk out of the school the day before, were now divided. Some rallied behind her, recognizing the injustice of what had happened, while others whispered cruelly, blaming her for the uproar. One girl in particular, Harper, took it upon herself to fan the flames. She's just trying to get attention. Harper sneered to her friends in the lunchroom. Her dad's some big-shot lawyer, and now she thinks she's better than everyone else. Maya heard the whispers but tried to ignore them. It wasn't until she found a nasty note stuffed into her locker, "Crybaby Carter," scrawled across the paper in bold black letters, that she broke down. That evening, as Maya sat on her bed, staring at the note, she felt a wave of despair. "Why does everyone hate me?" she whispered. Jordan, who had just entered her room, knelt beside her. "They don't hate you, Maya. They're scared. When people see someone standing up for themselves, it makes them uncomfortable, especially when they know they're wrong. But it's so hard," Maya said, tears streaming down her face. "I know it is," Jordan said, his voice soft. "But you're not alone. We'll get through this together. And when this is over, you'll see how strong you really are." Unbeknownst to them, Mrs. Hughes and Miss Peterson were scrambling to cover their tracks. Fearing the consequences of their actions, they began altering records and deleting emails. But what they didn't realize was that Jordan had already anticipated their moves. With his assistant's help, he had filed a formal complaint with the school board and contacted a local journalist who specialized in exposing educational injustices. The story was about to break, and when it did, there would be no hiding from the truth. The storm brewing around Elmwood High School intensified as the community caught wind of what had happened to Maya. News of the incident spread quickly after the local journalist Jordan contacted published a scathing expose titled, "Humiliated and Dismissed: The Shocking Treatment of a Young Girl at Elmwood High." The article laid bare not only Maya's experience, but also raised questions about the school's broader disciplinary practices. For the first time, the school was under scrutiny, not just from the local community, but from organizations advocating for educational equity. Parents began demanding answers, and the school board announced an emergency meeting to address the growing backlash. At home, Maya felt like her world had been turned upside down. While she appreciated her father's relentless support, the attention made her uneasy. She couldn't scroll through her social media without seeing comments about her story, some supportive, others cruel. "Dad," she said one evening, her voice hesitant, "do we have to keep fighting? What if we just let it go?" Jordan paused, looking at his daughter with a mix of sadness and determination. "Maya, I know this is hard, but this fight isn't just for you. It's for every kid who's been mistreated, every parent who's felt powerless. If we don't stand up now, they'll keep getting away with it." "But it's so overwhelming," Maya said, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know," Jordan said softly, pulling her into a hug. "But you're braver than you think, and you don't have to face this alone. I'm right here with you." Every step of the way, at the school, the tension was palpable. Mrs. Hughes and Miss Peterson were frantically trying to maintain control of the narrative. They held meetings with staff, crafted carefully worded statements, and tried to shift the blame onto Maya, claiming she had been disruptive and disrespectful. But their efforts began to unravel when Jordan's legal team uncovered an email thread that exposed their true motives. The emails revealed a pattern of targeting minority students with disproportionately harsh punishments, painting a picture of systemic bias that went far beyond Maya's case. As the school board meeting approached, Mrs. Hughes grew increasingly desperate. "We need to control this," she told Ms. Peterson, her voice strained. "If this gets out of hand, we're done." Ms. Peterson nodded, though her confidence was visibly shaken. "Maybe we should just apologize," she suggested weakly. "Apologize?" Mrs. Hughes snapped. "That's an admission of guilt. We can't afford that." The night of the school board meeting, the auditorium was packed. Parents, teachers, students, and reporters filled every seat, the air buzzing with tension. Jordan and Maya sat near the front, their presence a stark reminder of why everyone was there. When it was Jordan's turn to speak, he stood with the same quiet strength that had carried him through the past week. He recounted the events leading up to Maya's humiliation, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "My daughter made a simple mistake," he said, his eyes scanning the room. But instead of addressing it with compassion, the staff here chose to shame her. This isn't just about Maya. It's about a culture that allows this kind of treatment to happen, and it has to stop. As he spoke, the crowd listened intently, many nodding in agreement. But Mrs. Hughes, seated on the stage with the other administrators, looked visibly uncomfortable. When Jordan finished, the room erupted in applause. For the first time, Maya felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things would change. But as the meeting progressed, it became clear that the battle was far from over. Mrs. Hughes and her allies pushed back, denying any wrongdoing and insisting the school's policies were fair. The tension in the room reached a boiling point, and it was clear that the fight for justice was about to take a dramatic turn. Jordan glanced at Maya, his expression resolute. "This is just the beginning," he whispered. And Maya, though still nervous, nodded. She was ready to face whatever came next. The tension in the packed school board meeting room was electric, every eye in the auditorium fixed on the confrontation unfolding before them. Parents murmured in hushed tones, reporters scribbled frantically, and even the students who had come to observe were on the edge of their seats. Jordan Carter stood at the podium, his shoulders squared and his voice carrying the weight of both anger and conviction. Beside him, Maya sat with her hands clasped tightly together, her anxiety palpable. "This is not just about a dress code," Jordan said, his voice steady but laced with an unmistakable edge of emotion. "This is about the treatment of a young girl who was stripped of her dignity and sent home humiliated. It's about a school culture that prioritizes punitive measures over compassion and understanding. And it's about accountability. Accountability for the adults who failed her and for the policies that allowed this to happen." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Jordan pressed on, laying out his case with the precision of the seasoned lawyer he was. He presented the damning email evidence that his legal team had uncovered, projecting it onto the large screen at the front of the room for all to see. The room collectively gasped as the words appeared. "We need to make an example out of these students. They need to learn there are consequences for their actions, no matter how minor." The email, sent by Mrs. Hughes to several staff members, was proof of a deliberate and systemic pattern of targeting certain students like Maya. Jordan's jaw tightened as he turned to face the school board members seated at the long table on the stage. "How can you justify this?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly. "How can you allow someone in a position of authority to abuse their power like this? My daughter is not a statistic, and she's not a scapegoat. She's a child who deserved better." The board members exchanged nervous glances, clearly unprepared for the evidence and the overwhelming support Jordan was rallying from the community. Mrs. Hughes, sitting stiffly at the edge of the stage, felt the walls closing in. Her carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and she knew it. Beads of sweat formed on her brow as she glanced toward Miss Peterson, who looked equally rattled. "Do something," Hughes hissed under her breath. But Miss Peterson remained silent, her gaze fixed on the damning email projected on the screen. She had no defense. There was no defense. Finally, Hughes stood, her voice shaking as she addressed the room. "I understand that emotions are high, but let's not lose sight of the fact that we have policies for a reason. Maya Carter violated the dress code, and we handled the situation according to protocol." "Protocol?" Jordan interrupted, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Your protocol involved humiliating a child and sending her home without basic clothing. Is that the kind of school you're running? One where children are punished in ways that strip them of their dignity?" The crowd erupted into applause, and Hughes visibly recoiled. I didn't mean," she stammered, but the damage was done. As the meeting continued, the tension only escalated. Parents stood up to share their own stories of unfair treatment and bias at Elmwood High, each testimony adding fuel to the fire. One mother, her voice trembling, recounted how her son had been repeatedly targeted for minor infractions while other students were let off with warnings. A former student, now in college, shared how the school's punitive culture had left lasting scars on her confidence. Each story painted a picture of a system that was deeply flawed, and the crowd's frustration grew with every word. For Maya, sitting in the middle of it all, the experience was surreal. She felt a mix of emotions: shame, anger, fear, and most unexpectedly, hope. For the first time, she realized that this fight wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger, something that could make a difference for other kids like her. Jordan noticed a shift in his daughter's demeanor and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're doing great, Maya," he whispered. "Just a little longer." The turning point came when the superintendent, who had been sitting silently for most of the meeting, finally spoke. "I think we can all agree that what happened to Maya was unacceptable," he said, his voice measured. "And it's clear that there are systemic issues within this school that need to be addressed. As superintendent, I am recommending an immediate investigation into the practices at Elmwood High, and I will personally ensure that those responsible are held accountable." The room erupted in cheers, but the victory felt bittersweet. Maya glanced at Mrs. Hughes, who sat frozen in her chair, her face pale and her hands trembling. The once confident principal now looked like a shell of herself, the weight of her actions finally catching up to her. Jordan leaned down to Maya. "This isn't over yet," he said softly, "but we're one step closer to justice." And as the meeting adjourned, Maya stood a little taller, knowing that for the first time her voice and the voices of so many others had been heard. The energy in the room was electric as Superintendent Green's announcement sent waves through the crowd. Parents cheered, students whispered among themselves, and reporters hurried to capture the statement. But for Maya, the moment felt unreal, like she was watching everything unfold from outside her own body. She turned to her father, searching his face for some sign of what came next. Jordan gave her a small, reassuring nod before standing to address the superintendent. "An investigation is a step in the right direction," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But let's be clear, this isn't just about an internal review. This is about real accountability. My daughter was humiliated. Other students have faced the same discrimination. We're not stopping until we see real change." The crowd erupted again, voices of support echoing through the auditorium. Superintendent Green nodded, visibly uneasy but resolute. "I understand, Mr. Carter. We will take immediate action. And in light of the evidence presented today, Principal Hughes and Ms. Peterson will be placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. Pending further review." A stunned silence filled the room. Then, in an instant, voices rose in a mix of shock, agreement, and whispers of justice finally being served. Mrs. Hughes, her face now drained of all color, shot up from her chair. "You can't do this," she protested, her voice high and frantic. "I've given my life to this school. I was just following policy." Green's gaze was unwavering, And that's exactly why we need to review those policies and the people enforcing them. Maya watched as Mrs. Hughes sank back into her seat, eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. Miss Peterson, meanwhile, simply lowered her head, the weight of her guilt finally settling in. For the first time since the ordeal began, Maya felt like she could breathe. As the meeting adjourned, people flooded toward Maya and Jordan, offering words of support. Classmates she barely knew whispered, "I'm so sorry you went through that," while parents thanked Jordan for standing up for not just his daughter, but for all students. Harper, the girl who had taunted Maya earlier that week, hesitated before stepping forward. "Maya, she started, then exhaled. "I was wrong. I shouldn't have said those things. I guess I was scared to stand up." Maya studied her for a moment before nodding. "Just don't be silent next time," she said. Harper swallowed hard and nodded back. As Maya and Jordan stepped outside, the night air was cool against her skin. She looked up at her father, the man who had fought relentlessly for her, and finally allowed herself to smile. "We did it," she whispered. Jordan wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Yeah, baby girl, we did." But even as they walked toward their car, Maya knew this was only the beginning. Justice had been set in motion, but the real work, ensuring change lasted, was still ahead. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid to face it. The morning after the school board meeting, Maya woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing endlessly on her nightstand. She groggily reached for it, blinking against the light of the screen. Hundreds of notifications. Her social media accounts were flooded with messages. Some from friends, some from classmates she barely knew, and even strangers who had seen her story in the news. Some comments were supportive. "You're so brave for standing up for yourself. This is exactly why we need change in schools." Others were more ignorant or cruel. "She broke the rules. Why is everyone making a big deal out of this? Her dad only got her out of trouble because he's famous." Maya sighed, dropping her phone on the bed. The weight of everything that had happened over the past few days was still heavy on her chest. Even though she had won in some ways, the victory didn't feel as simple as she had hoped. As if sensing her daughter's unease, Jordan knocked on the door. "You up?" he asked gently. "Yeah," Maya said, sitting up. "Kind of." Jordan stepped into the room and sat on the edge of her bed. "I know it's been a lot," he said. "How are you feeling?" Maya hesitated. "I don't know. Relieved, I guess, but also nervous. It's like, even though Mrs. Hughes and Miss Peterson got in trouble, there's still people who think what happened was okay. What if things don't actually change?" Jordan nodded thoughtfully. "Change takes time, Maya. It's not always instant. But what we did, forced people to pay attention. And that's the first step. Now, it's up to the school and the district to follow through." Maya bit her lip. "And what if they don't?" "Then we keep holding them accountable," Jordan said simply. "We don't stop until they do the right thing." Maya took a deep breath, nodding. She wasn't sure she had the same fire her father did, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let what happened to her happen to anyone else. Back at Elmwood High, the next week at school was different. For the first time, students openly talked about the school's unfair disciplinary policies. Some teachers, ones Maya hadn't even realized had been silently watching, began advocating for change. And with Mrs. Hughes and Miss Peterson suspended, there was a noticeable shift in the school's atmosphere. Maya was still nervous walking through the halls, especially when she noticed certain students whispering. But to her surprise, many of them now looked at her with a quiet respect. During lunch, she sat with her best friend Olivia, who had been by her side since day one. "So," Olivia said, grinning, "you're basically a legend now." Maya groaned. "Please don't say that. I'm serious. Everyone's talking about how you and your dad took on the school and actually won." Maya stabbed at her food. "It doesn't really feel like I won anything. It just feels exhausting." Olivia's expression softened. "I get that, but you did something important, Maya. You didn't just help yourself, you helped a lot of people. Maya looked around the cafeteria, realizing for the first time that students like her, students who had always felt invisible or unheard, were standing a little taller. Maybe Olivia was right. Maybe this was bigger than just her. A final conversation at the end of the school day. Maya was heading toward the parking lot when a familiar voice called her name. Maya. She turned to see Harper standing a few feet away, shifting nervously from foot to foot. Maya sighed, crossing her arms. What do you want, Harper? Harper hesitated before speaking. I really am sorry, she said quietly. I was a jerk, and not just to you, to a lot of people. I guess I thought if I didn't speak up, it wasn't my problem. Maya studied her for a moment, and now... Harper swallowed. Now I know that silence is part of the problem. She exhaled, then looked Maya in the eye. I want to be better. Maya wasn't sure if Harper would actually change, but she saw something in her expression, something real. And maybe, just maybe, this whole situation had opened her eyes. After a long pause, Maya finally nodded. Then do better. Harper nodded back. No promises, no forced friendship, just understanding. As Maya turned toward her dad's car, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. Maybe things wouldn't change overnight. Maybe there were still battles ahead. But she wasn't alone in this fight, and that made all the difference. A month had passed since the school board meeting, and things at Elmwood High were no longer the same. The district had officially revised its dress code policies, removing vague and discriminatory language that had disproportionately targeted students of color. Teachers underwent bias training, and a student advisory board, including Maya, was formed to ensure that student voices were heard in future decisions. Though Maya still felt the occasional stares and whispers in the hallways, she no longer let them weigh her down. She had stepped into a fight she never asked for, but now that she was in it, she refused to back down. One afternoon, as she packed up her locker, Ms. Ramirez, her history teacher, approached her. Maya, I just wanted to say I'm proud of you, she said warmly. Most people your age wouldn't have had the courage to do what you did. Maya smiled. I didn't think I had a choice. Ms. Ramirez nodded. Sometimes, the best leaders don't go looking for the fight. The fight finds them. Maya thought about that as she headed outside, where Jordan was waiting for her by the car. He grinned as she approached. How does it feel to be an agent of change? Maya rolled her eyes. Exhausting. Jordan laughed, pulling her into a side hug. That's how you know you did it right. As they drove home, Maya stared out the window, thinking about how much had changed in just a few weeks. What happened to her had been unfair, humiliating, and painful, but it had also been a turning point. She wasn't just a girl who got sent home without pants anymore. She was a girl who stood up, spoke out, and made a difference. And that was something no one could ever take away from her.